In my last documentary, I promised you we would explore the Underground Railroad, not simply as an American story, but as a Canadian one, because for thousands of freedom seekers, the journey did not end at the border. It began again. This is Black Canadian legacy, and this is the Underground Railroad in Canada, the truth behind the promised land. For enslaved people in the United States, there was a phrase whispered in the darkness, a phrase that means hope, a phrase that meant freedom. Follow the North Star to the promised land. That promised land was Canada, and the journey to reach it was the Underground Railroad, a network of secret routes, safe houses, and courageous people who risked everything to help freedom seekers escape bondage. But here's what most people don't know. The story of the Underground Railroad didn't end at the Canadian border. For thousands of Black people who fled north, Canada was just the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with both triumph and struggle. This is the story of the Underground Railroad in Canada, the truth behind the promise, the reality of freedom, and the legacy that still shapes this nation today. To understand the Underground Railroad, you first have to understand what people were running from. By the 1850s, there were nearly 4 million enslaved people in the United States. Slavery wasn't just legal. It was protected by federal law. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 made it a crime to help enslaved people escape. It also allowed slave catchers to cross state lines to recapture people who had fled, even in northern states where slavery was illegal. This meant that even if you escaped to Pennsylvania, New York, or Ohio, you were never truly safe. Slave catchers could kidnap you at any moment and drag you back into bondage. There was only one place in North America where the Fugitive Slave Act had no power: Canada. In 1834, the British Empire abolished slavery throughout its territories, including Canada. This meant that once you crossed the Canadian border, you were legally free. Slave catchers couldn't touch you. Your former enslaver had no legal claim on you. You were by law a free person. And so Canada became known as the Promised Land, the land of Canaan, the place where freedom was real. But why Canada specifically? Why not Mexico or the Caribbean or somewhere else? There were several reasons. First, geography. Canada shared a long border with the northern United States, making it the closest destination for people escaping from the Upper South and Midwest. Second, British law. Britain had abolished slavery decades before the United States, and British territories offered legal protection that didn't exist anywhere else on the continent. Third, existing Black communities. By the time the Underground Railroad reached its peak in the 1850s, there were already established Black settlements in Canada, communities founded by Black loyalists who had come after the American Revolution and by earlier freedom seekers. These communities provided support, resources, and proof that Black people could build lives in Canada. And fourth, the myth of Canada itself. Stories circulated among enslaved people that Canada was a land of equality, a place where Black people were treated as citizens, a place where you could own land, raise your children in freedom, and live without fear. Some of these stories were true, some were exaggerated. But the promise of Canada was powerful enough to make thousands of people risk their lives for the journey north. So how many people actually made it to Canada via the Underground Railroad? Historians estimate that between 30,000 and 40,000 freedom seekers reached Canada between 1800 and 1865. Some estimates go as high as 100,000, but records are incomplete because the Underground Railroad operated in secrecy. What we do know is that by 1860, there were significant Black populations in Ontario, Quebec, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick. The largest concentrations were in Ontario, particularly in cities like Toronto, Hamilton, Chatham, and Windsor, and in rural settlements like Dawn, Buxton, and Wilberforce. These weren't just refugees passing through. These were people building lives, buying land, starting businesses, raising families, going to school, establishing churches, publishing newspapers. They weren't just escaping from something, they were creating something new. And that's where the real story begins. The Underground Railroad wasn't actually a railroad. It was a network of people, black and white, enslaved and free, who helped freedom seekers escape to the north. The terminology borrowed from railroads was deliberate. Safe houses were called stations. People who hid freedom seekers were called station masters. Guides who led people on the journey were called conductors. And the freedom seekers themselves were called passengers or cargo. This language created a code that allowed people to communicate in secret. If someone said, "The train is coming tonight," everyone knew what that meant. The network operated mostly at night. Freedom seekers traveled under cover of darkness, following the North Star, moving from one safe house to the next. During the day, they would hide in barns, attics, root cellars, churches, wherever they could avoid detection. The journey could take weeks or even months. Some people walked hundreds of miles. Some rode in wagons, hidden under hay or grain. Some traveled by boat along rivers and coastlines, and every mile of the journey was dangerous. The risks were immense. If you were caught, you would be returned to slavery and likely face brutal punishment, whipping, branding, sail to the deep south where conditions were even worse. Your family could be sold away from you as punishment. Slave catchers patrolled the border regions. They used dogs, informants, and violence to track down escapees. They didn't care if you had reached a free state. The Fugitive Slave Act meant they could legally kidnap you and bring you back. Even in Canada, the danger didn't completely disappear. While slavery was illegal, racist attitudes still existed. Some white Canadians were sympathetic to American slaveholders and helped slave catchers unofficially. There were cases of kidnapping attempts even on Canadian soil. Freedom seekers also faced harsh winters. Many arrived with nothing but the clothes on their backs. They had to find shelter, food, and work in an unfamiliar place, often in the middle of winter. And yet they came. They kept coming. Because the promise of freedom was worth the risk. The conductors, the people who guided freedom seekers north, risked everything to help others escape. The most famous conductor was Harriet Tubman. Born into slavery in Maryland, Tubman escaped in 1849 and immediately began returning to the South to lead others to freedom. She made approximately 13 trips and rescued around 70 people, including her own family members. Tubman was fearless. She carried a gun, not just to protect herself from slave catchers, but to ensure that no one in her group turned back out of fear and risked exposing the route. She never lost a passenger. After the Fugitive Slave Act passed in 1850, Tubman began leading people all the way to Canada. She settled for a time in St. Catharines, Ontario, where she worked and planned her rescue missions. She said, "I wouldn't trust Uncle Sam with my people no longer. I brought them all clear off to Canada." But Tubman wasn't the only conductor. There were many others, both black and white, who risked their lives to guide freedom seekers north. People like Josiah Henson, who escaped to Canada in 1830 and then returned to the United States multiple times to lead others to freedom. Henson eventually settled in Dresden, Ontario, where he founded the Dawn Settlement, a community for Black refugees. People like John Freeman Walls, who escaped slavery in North Carolina and settled near Windsor, Ontario, where his log cabin became a station on the Underground Railroad, and countless others whose names we don't know, but whose courage made freedom possible for thousands of people. Imagine the moment you cross the border into Canada. You've traveled for weeks, maybe months. You've slept in forests and barns. You've gone hungry. You've walked until your feet bled. You've hidden from slave catchers. And then finally, you cross a river or step across an invisible line, and someone tells you you're free. You're in Canada now. The slave catchers can't touch you here. For many freedom seekers, this moment was overwhelming. There are accounts of people falling to their knees and kissing the ground, of people weeping with relief, of people unable to believe after everything they'd been through that they had actually made it. But after the relief came a new reality. What now? You're free, yes, but you're also in a new country. You don't know the language if you crossed into Quebec. You don't know the laws. You have no money, no home, no job. Winter is coming, and you have to build a life from nothing. Fortunately, freedom seekers didn't have to face this alone. Across Canada, particularly in Ontario, Black communities had been established to help new arrivals. One of the most significant was the Dawn Settlement, founded by Josiah Henson in 1841 near Dresden, Ontario. Dawn had a sawmill, a school, and a manual labor institute where people could learn trades. It became a beacon for freedom seekers looking to build new lives. Another important settlement was Buxton, founded in 1849 by Reverend William King, a white abolitionist who freed his own enslaved people and brought them to Canada. Buxton was carefully planned. Each family received 50 acres of land, which they could purchase on credit. The settlement had strict rules: no alcohol, mandatory school attendance for children, and regular church attendance. Within a decade, Buxton had over 1,000 residents, a thriving economy, and one of the best schools in the region. In Chatham, Ontario, another large Black community developed. By 1861, Chatham had a population of over 2,000 Black residents. It was the site of the 1858 Chatham Convention, where John Brown met with Black leaders to plan his raid on Harper's Ferry. Toronto, Windsor, Hamilton, and other cities also had significant Black populations. In these communities, freedom seekers found churches, schools, mutual aid societies, and newspapers. They found people who spoke their language, who understood their experiences, who could help them navigate this new life. But life in Canada wasn't easy. Yes, slavery was illegal, but racism wasn't. Many white Canadians resented the arrival of Black refugees. Some towns tried to pass laws to discourage Black settlement. Some churches and schools were segregated. Job opportunities were limited. Black men often could only find work as laborers or farmers, even if they had other skills. Black women worked as domestic servants. Land ownership was possible, but difficult. Many Black settlers bought land in remote areas where the soil was poor and farming was hard. Winters were brutal, especially for people who had never experienced snow before. Despite these challenges, Black Canadians built thriving communities. They started businesses, barbershops, restaurants, blacksmith shops, carpentry businesses. They founded churches, which became the center of community life and the primary social support system. They established schools because many communities wouldn't allow Black children in white schools. The Buxton School, for example, became so well regarded that some white families sent their children there. They published newspapers. Mary Ann Shadd Carey founded the Provincial Freeman in 1853, the first newspaper in North America published by a Black woman. It advocated for abolition, equality, and Black self-reliance. And they organized. Black Canadians formed mutual aid societies, anti-slavery organizations, and political groups. They held conventions to discuss their rights and lobby the government for equal treatment. They weren't passive recipients of freedom. They were active builders of their own futures. In 1861, the American Civil War began. And suddenly, the flow of the Underground Railroad reversed. Many Black Canadians returned to the United States to fight for the Union and for the freedom of those still enslaved. Approximately 40,000 Black men served in the Union Army and Navy. Some of them were Canadian-born or had been living in Canada for years. After the war ended in 1865 and slavery was abolished, many Black Canadians faced a choice: stay in Canada or return to the United States. Some stayed. They had built lives in Canada. They owned land. They had businesses, families, communities. Canada was home now, but others returned. They wanted to reunite with family members they had left behind. They wanted to help rebuild the South. They wanted to be part of the new America that was supposed to treat them as citizens. By the 1870s, the Black population in Canada had declined significantly as people moved back south, but those who stayed continued to build. Their descendants are part of the fabric of Canadian society today. The Underground Railroad left a lasting mark on Canada. The settlements founded by freedom seekers became towns and cities that still exist today. Buxton, Ontario, is now a National Historic Site. You can visit the Buxton Museum and learn about the families who built that community. Dresden is home to Uncle Tom's Cabin Historic Site, honoring Josiah Henson, whose life story inspired Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel. The John Freeman Walls Historic Site near Windsor preserves the log cabin that served as an Underground Railroad station. In Chatham, you can visit the site of the 1858 convention and learn about John Brown's connections to Black Canadian leaders. In Toronto, St. Lawrence Hall was a gathering place for abolitionists and freedom seekers. Churches like the British Methodist Episcopal Church, founded by Black Canadians in 1856, still stand today. And the descendants of Underground Railroad refugees are still here. They are lawyers, doctors, teachers, artists, entrepreneurs, politicians. They are woven into the fabric of Canadian society. Many don't even know their own family history, that their ancestors were freedom seekers who walked hundreds of miles for the chance to build a new life. So why does the Underground Railroad still matter today? Because it's a reminder that Canada was a place of refuge for people fleeing oppression. But it's also a reminder that refuge didn't mean equality. Black Canadians had to fight for their rights. They had to fight for access to schools, to jobs, to housing. They had to fight against segregation and discrimination. And in many ways, that fight continues. The Underground Railroad also matters because it shows the power of community, resistance, and resilience. Freedom seekers didn't just survive, they thrived. They built institutions, they created culture, they demanded justice, and it matters because these stories have been ignored for too long. The Underground Railroad is often taught as an American story that ends at the Canadian border. But the story didn't end there. The story continued in the settlements and communities built by Black Canadians, in the newspapers they published, in the conventions they held, in the lives they lived. This is Canadian history. This is Black Canadian history, and it's time we remember it. The Underground Railroad brought thousands of people to Canada seeking the promise of freedom. What they found was both hope and hardship. But what they built was extraordinary. Communities, institutions, and a legacy that still resonates today. Between 30,000 and 40,000 freedom seekers crossed into Canada. They were not just escaping something. They were building something. Churches, schools, communities, institutions. The Underground Railroad shaped this country, and its story belongs in our classrooms. They didn't arrive with much, no money, no guarantees, no welcome mat, just courage, just faith, just the desperate, unshakable belief that freedom was worth everything it cost. And what did they do when they got here? They didn't just survive, they built churches that still stand, schools that still teach, communities that still breathe, institutions that still serve. They took the promise of Canada and they held it to its word. They said, If this land claims to offer freedom, then we will build in that freedom. If this land claims to offer equality, then we will live that equality. If this land claims to be a promised land, then we will make it one. And they did, from nothing, from absolutely nothing. They built something extraordinary. The Underground Railroad didn't just bring people to Canada. It shaped Canada. It shaped our communities. It shaped our culture. It shaped our character as a nation. And yet, for too long, this story sat in the shadows, unacknowledged, undertaught, undervalued, but not anymore. There was a man who understood this better than most, a man who himself broke barriers that had never been broken before, a man who knew what it meant to walk into rooms where no one who looked like him had ever walked before. His name was Lincoln Alexander, Canada's first Black member of Parliament, Canada's first Black federal cabinet minister, the 24th Lieutenant Governor of Ontario, a giant. And he said something that every freedom seeker who crossed that border understood in their bones, even if they never had the words for it. Go to school. You're a little black boy. You need your education. Those were his mother's words, 7 words. That launched a legacy, because that's what the freedom seekers understood. That freedom without education is incomplete. That liberation without legacy is temporary. That the rising that happened after. Lincoln Alexander's mother knew it. Lincoln Alexander lived it. And the 40,000 freedom seekers who crossed into Canada, they proved it. Their courage shaped this nation. Their sacrifice built this country. Their faith moved mountains that had stood for centuries. And their story deserves to be told, not just in February, not just in classrooms, not just in museums, but every day in our homes, around our dinner tables, to our children, to our grandchildren, to anyone who will listen. Because if we forget where we came from, we lose the strength to go where we're going. This is Black Canadian legacy. This is the foundation we must remember. This is the story that demands to be told. Next time, we explore what happened to one of those communities, a community that was promised freedom, that was promised dignity, that built something beautiful, and then watch the government tear it down. Africville, Nova Scotia, a story of love, of community, of devastating betrayal, and ultimately of resilience. A story every Canadian needs to know, because if we don't know what was done, we can't make right what was broken. Subscribe now so you don't miss it, because that story is coming and it will change how you see this country. Legacy doesn't ask for permission. It demands to be remembered. This is Black Canadian Legacy TV, in the spirit of Lincoln Alexander, who never waited for permission to make history. Documentary storytelling meets heritage education. Black history told with pride, power, and purpose. As we journey through the past to understand the power of the present, subscribe and join the movement to keep these legacies alive, because our history is Canada's history.